I remember being astounded and perplexed a number of years ago when old neighbors of mine, and then as I had moved out of the house of my parents, had expressed in a conversation, and I don't even remember where the conversation started, that they were very surprised to hear that we as Catholics believed in the resurrection of the dead, which I almost couldn't even process. That boggled my mind, because that, if you were going to list in a very short list all of the things that we hold dearest to our hearts and our beliefs as Catholics, that makes the short list. In a few minutes, we're going to pray the creed together. Pay attention, it's in there. And so I couldn't understand how reasonably well-educated people who were not hermits, who lived in a country that is, at least on paper, a large majority Christian, didn't know that Christians believed in the resurrection. It's so central for us that St. Paul tells us that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then we are the most pitiable of all people, and we might as well eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. St. Paul did not often beat around the bush, but he's getting across a point. The resurrection of the dead is a great hope that we hold, that our loved ones who have passed on, and we ourselves one day, will not merely vacate this body forever and kind of float around in some sort of spiritual space with God in heaven, but that we will get these bodies back. That at the last judgment, our bodies will be returned to us. And if we're going to heaven, our bodies are going to be returned to us in a great deal better shape than we left them. Which is a wonderful hope, because not only by the end of most of our lives do our bodies do a great deal more creaking and groaning than we wish they would, but there are not many of us who don't have something about ourselves that we wish we could change. That we look in the mirror and think our bodies to be somewhat imperfect. Our bodies will be perfectly united with our souls, which will be perfectly united with Christ and his heavenly Father, which means our bodies will be in pretty good shape for eternity. That you and I will get to spend all of eternity with God, not merely as disembodied spirits, but actually physically present with him forever, which is really cool and ought to be a source of great hope. So why don't people know that about us? How can somebody live their entire lives surrounded by Christians and have no idea that we even believe that? I have two thoughts, and I apparently got very excited in my homily last night and ran about 7 minutes longer than I wanted to. I think they were a good 7 minutes, but I'm going to try not to inflict them on you this morning. And so I'll try to keep these two thoughts as focused as I am capable of. First, is the witness of our actions. One of the things that I and many of my priestly brothers have noticed over the last generation is how much less important the funeral and the visitation the night beforehand and the graveside committal afterwards seem to have become for us as a society. I never see funeral processions anymore. I never get stopped in traffic by a funeral driving by, and it actually kind of saddens me. The only time I see funeral processions is when I'm actually in them as the priest. And I think when we're not celebrating, when we're not giving when a loved one passes, when we're not giving the family a chance to properly grieve, when we're not giving the family a chance to properly pray, especially recognizing that as Catholics we also believe in purgatory, which means that praying for our deceased loved ones is a great act of love, that if we're not giving ourselves to rejoice, to share stories about them, to gather together at a luncheon, to tell tales and to encourage one another in our hope that this is not the end of their story. That just because their physical body has died for a little while does not mean that it's gone forever. That there's something wrong, and the sign value of that missing in society makes it easy for people not to realize that this matters to us. I've always found it fascinating that in the list of corporal and spiritual works of mercy, which are like Mother Church taking all of the different ways that you and I can be reflections of the love of Jesus Christ in the world and like condensing them into the short list. So these are the things that most clearly show the love of Jesus Christ to other people. Burying the dead makes that list. Like, that's how important it is to us. And in fact, it's a beautiful story in the Old Testament in the book of Tobit, I think, among other places, where an individual found it to be so important to show respect for the dead bodies of fellow citizens, not even family members, just fellow citizens, that he risked his own life and limb to sneak out in the middle of the night, take the bodies which had been left out to be eaten by dogs, and give them a proper burial. That the sentence was death if the king found anybody doing that, because he was a screwball and not right in the head and thought it was appropriate to leave his enemies' bodies out for the birds. But this man, night after night after night, would get up, presumably with a large shovel and maybe some help, get these bodies of people he may not have even known and give them a proper burial. Because a proper burial speaks, without even needing to use words, that we respect you enough and we believe that you will rise again, that we recognize that your body is not a thing to be thrown away, but it is something that you have loaned us and we will give you back one day. That I think that's there's powerful sign value in that we've lost in a society that does not value funerals as much as it used to. It's also why the church a few generations ago actually did prohibit cremation. That we don't now, to be clear. We prefer inhumation, full body burials with a casket, but we allow cremation now. But there was a time, and a long time in the church, where we forbade it at all. Why? Because for a long time in a number of countries around the world, especially the communist and socialist ones, burning the body of a deceased person was the equivalent and was intended to be a way of flipping the bird to Christianity. That it was a way of saying, not only has this person died, but their body is nothing more than worm food. We do not believe in the resurrection, and this is how we're going to show the world. That cremation was a direct testimony. It was a public proclamation of a denial of belief in the resurrection. And so Christians, when much of the world saw cremation that way, could not participate. That we had to bury our loved ones in caskets to be a statement to the contrary. To say, you might not believe in an afterlife, you might not believe that my grandpa's coming back from the dead, that he will rise again and be reunited with his body, even though his soul isn't in it right now, but I do, and this is how I'm showing you that. That there was great sign value, and there was a battle of wills taking place in many countries around the world in the practices that surrounded the death of our loved ones. And I think perhaps because the sign value of cremation no longer testifies against the resurrection as strongly as it did before, that we don't see as much of an urgency or need in having the burial of someone with their full body intact. And so again, the church recognizes that there are numerous circumstances in which cremation is appropriate. Even sometimes if it's as simple as the fact that cremation is a lot cheaper. Though I will say, as a culture, I think we need to do better and figure out how to make inhumation burials a lot more affordable for people. And if not as a culture, then as a church. Because I do think it's a tragedy and a failure if a family feels obligated to cremate their loved one purely out of financial urgency. But we still encourage the inhumation burial because there is strong sign value there. That at the visitation the night before the funeral, there is a lot of closure that can be brought by actually seeing the dead body of my loved one. And not only merely seeing it, but seeing the great love and attention that's been shown to it. Because the people who work at funeral homes are miracle workers. I do not know how they can make our deceased loved ones look as good as they do oftentimes in their casket. To be able to see how much respect and tenderness and mercy was shown to my grandfather or to someone's spouse or child is a great sign of love and a great reminder that their soul may not be in the body now, but that body is still valuable because it's their body and they're going to get it back again one day. That I think the funeral itself is important because there's a catharsis that comes with being able to pray and honestly in a public place, in a place in the eyes of God, to cry, to be able to properly mourn the loss of a loved one. And then in the committal to see the respect once again that's shown to my loved one and to their body by extending to them a proper burial, by saying that this is the place where their body is now in anticipation of the fact that their body will be with them in heaven forever. That when we lose all of the ritual and the human experience of the process of a funeral liturgy, I think we lose, implicitly at least, what the ritual is meant to be teaching us and allowing us to hold in our hearts. So first, I think our actions have not told the world that we believe in the resurrection as much in this generation as they did in past generations. Second, I think our words don't testify to our belief in the resurrection as much anymore either. Like, let's be honest, when is the last time you or I, and I'm an exception because I was preparing this homily and so I actually have had this conversation this last week. In general, when's the last time you or I had a conversation with anyone, old, young, family member, stranger, about the hope that we hold in the resurrection of the dead? It's probably been a while. That our conversations do not testify to the fact that we firmly believe that death is not the end of the story. And I think there are several reasons for that. And I will concede that being Irish, I am somewhat biased because we as a culture are almost too comfortable talking about death. We and the Russians do it all the time. I think it annoys the rest of the world. The death is like common conversation around the water cooler for us. But I think it needs to be more common conversation than we've allowed it to be. Because there's a lot of great joy and encouragement that comes from that. It's a famous story of St. Benedict and St. Scholastica, siblings from the early church who lived respectively in a monastery and in a convent. And a couple times a year, St. Scholastica and her sister nuns would come and visit St. Benedict and his fellow monks. And the rule of their communities was very clear, that it was immensely unusual for guests to spend the night at a monastery, and it was absolutely unheard of and scandalous for women to spend the night at a monastery. That when they would come to visit, once the day was getting late, the expectation was Scholastica and her sisters would go home. Now, that in spite of the fact that they were siblings, that they were bound in their love for God to the rules of their religious communities. But this time was different that as dinner concluded and the small talk was coming to a close, Scholastica, knowing that Benedict was about to kick her out, asked her brother if he would not make an exception and allow them to stay up all night that night talking about the hope of eternity, talking about their hope in the resurrection of the dead, what things are going to be like after this life. That she said, God's revealed to me I don't have many days left, that I'm going to die soon. And it would be a great encouragement to me to stay up tonight with you as my brother and build up some hope in what's to come. You know, that she was a saintly woman. I can't imagine Scholastica probably thought that she would be going to hell, but I think it's a very human and natural thing, having never gone through death, that it causes us a certain amount of anxiety. We don't know what it's going to be like. We expect there's probably going to be a little bit of pain involved, and so it's nice when someone accompanies us through that. And Benedict said, no, that's not the rule. We follow the rule in our love for God. Sorry, you have to go home, sister. And so Scholastica famously bows her head at the dinner table in prayer for a few moments, and then all of a sudden the entire monastery shakes from peals of thunder and lightning outside, and a torrential downpour begins. The sisters cannot go anywhere. And Benedict gets this horrified look on his face like his sister's a witch and goes, "Sister, what have you done?" And Scholastica's simple reply to her brother was, I asked you, and you said no. I asked God, and God said yes. And so Scholastica got to spend the entire night staying up with her brother, talking about the hope of the resurrection. And then finally the next morning, they departed when the weather had cleared, went back to their convent, and a few days later, Benedict, long before one of the sisters came to the monastery to inform them of the sad news, Benedict saw his sister's soul rise to heaven, that she had passed away. Even a saint desired the encouragement of a conversation about what comes next. How much more so do the rest of us, who maybe have not been afforded the miraculous visions or the intense hope that comes with such a close life united to our Lord Jesus. That we don't know what's coming next exactly, but we do know that it's going to be something beautiful, and that we are going to get our bodies back, that death does not get the last word in our lives. And so I think it's important for us not to be afraid to talk about death as Catholics and as Christians. Because death is, in some ways, a fearful thing. It's anxiety-inducing. There's often pain that comes along with it. But death is a natural step. It is one chapter that will take place in every single one of our stories, without exception. And it's a chapter in this story that leads, as we firmly believe and are assured, to a much cooler set of chapters after this one. That, especially with Thanksgiving approaching, as Americans, it's long been our kind of unspoken rule that when we're talking with in-laws and extended family and certainly strangers, that we do not discuss politics or religion. I would add to that we also don't talk about death. And I think it's a tragedy in our world that not only do we not talk about death with each other in a general way, that we're afraid to talk about death with our loved ones when it's clear that they're dying. That this is something I've seen often enough, that we might get the diagnosis or kind of the outcome from the doctor for our grandparents or our parents who've reached the end of the road, that they have a couple months to live at best. And part of us becomes afraid to even share that news with them. That somehow we think we're going to be causing them great anxiety or fear. Number one, I found in my experience, most people who are approaching death instinctively know that they are. That they know that their body is slowly shutting down. They know that their health is on the decline, and that this is a dive from which they will probably not recover. And if that's true, then in our fear of discussing death with them, not only are we not sparing them fear and anxiety, we're actually depriving them of our companionship as they approach the fear of those last moments. That we're depriving them of the opportunity to be able to share with someone they love and who loves them what they are afraid of, what anxieties they have, what things they have left undone in their life that they would like to be able to conclude, the people to whom they have to apologize, the things that they would like to get in order for future generations of their family, the will that they might like to write and leave behind. That we deprive them of our accompaniment as they approach death. And then our fear being understood by them, I think makes them more afraid to talk about it too. That we should be able to discuss death because death is something for us. As St. Francis of Assisi so beautifully put it, is the sister who arranges our meeting with Jesus. That death is the logical step by which we come into contact with Jesus Christ and he leads our souls home to heaven. That is something that might cause anxiety, but it is something that should not cause great fear. And I think if we discussed it more, it would be less fearful of a topic. And so as we celebrate All Souls Day this weekend, as we honor not merely the canonized saints and all of those who are in heaven, but as we honor those who are in purgatory too, who still need our prayers, to whom we can still show our love, we ask God for the grace that we need as Christians to let the entire world know that we believe in the resurrection and it's a big deal. That we should not live in a world where a well-educated person somehow cannot know that Christians and Catholics have great hope in the coming resurrection of the body. If our actions speak and testify to that fact, and our words speak and testify to that fact, I think it will make it much easier for us not only to bring other people to Jesus Christ, but for us to be able to let go of some of our own unnecessary fears and anxieties, to do the same for our loved ones, and to be ready when death comes to meet us, to be received by our Lord with joy and to be welcomed home.